Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast. This week on PA Books, Jim Remsen, author of Back from Battle.
Jim Remsen is the author of Back from Battle, the forgotten story of Pennsylvania's Camp Discharge and the weary Civil War soldiers it served. Where was Camp Discharge located?
It was actually in a spot that plenty of people have passed by and not known it. It's in what is now Gladwin, PA, on a slope that overlooks the Schuylkill Expressway. So thousands of motorists whiz by there having no clue that that's what they're passing. It's a wooded slope that goes up from the Schuylkill River to a bluff above, and the camp was in that slice of woodland and some of the bluff up above.
Now, this is an area outside of Philadelphia. At the time,
Correct.
During the Civil War, was this a rural area?
It was farmland, pasture land, lightly settled. Farms were scattered, and a few small settlements and crossroads settlements, but by and large it was open farmland.
Why was the camp established?
Yeah, that's a good question. Why was it established at all, and then why it was located there? It was set up in 1864, 3 years into the Civil War, to facilitate the discharge out of their regiments of men who had signed up 3 years earlier, and their term of duty was 3 years. They were called 3-year men, and their time was up. And so they were wanting to get out. They felt that the government had a duty to let them out on time. They had served their time, given their pound of flesh and then more, and they wanted out. Their families wanted them to return home. Some of them re-upped into stayed in the military, but the vast majority wanted out. So this camp was set up to process out a particular group of soldiers, both Pennsylvania volunteers from the eastern part, whose regiments had been mustered in the eastern part of Pennsylvania. Some of the men actually were from central and western Pennsylvania, but the point was their regiments had trained and been mustered in camps in eastern PA as part of this jurisdiction. And these were in those regiments, but these were also men who had been cut off from their regiments during the war through circumstances of war. They might have been sent on detached duty elsewhere. They might have been injured and been stuck behind while their regiment marched off elsewhere. They might have been captured. Many of them, hundreds of them, had been captured and held in Confederate prisons down south. So the rest of their regiment had stuck together and moved off through battle, and then finally were mustered out as a group. These were the stragglers who, for one reason or another, had been stuck, left behind. They made their way up and were directed to this camp, which was really particularly to handle these stragglers, is a term I will use for them. Why it was located there on a remote hillside outside of Philadelphia seems to be because of a fear of contagion, and because there were a lot of camp diseases that a lot of these soldiers had, and the public was nervous about them. Public authorities were wanting to have some separation. And it was placed up there. It was along a rail line, so there was ready access, but it was a remote location. So the Army leased the site from one of the farmers who owned that property, and actually his farmhouse as well. And the commandant of the camp moved into the farmhouse. The camp was set up in late 1864. It was only there for about a year, processing as quickly, as efficiently as it could these often very sick men who were coming up in spurts from the south, sometimes alone, sometimes in small groups.
So did they come directly to Camp Discharge, or did they go someplace else and then were sent to Camp Discharge?
Yeah, well, there were probably 100 different ways, 100 different stories. they would administratively be directed to Philadelphia, to the mustering office in downtown Philadelphia, where they would report, and their papers would be held by the mustering adjutant's office, and then the men were given passes and sent up to Camp Discharge. And then the task of the adjutant's office was to chase down their paperwork, their full reports that were held by their regiments, and who knows where the regiments were, and there was no texting and no email back then, so couriers would be scurrying around. Often their regiments were still fighting down in the field, or had been, other cases, all mustered out, and people were, scattered back home. So it was a task that sometimes would take weeks, many weeks, to reconcile their paperwork. So they would go to the camp and kill time, basically, until everything was squared away. And then some officer would report to the camp with their final pay, with their discharge paper, and they would figure out if they wanted to buy their weapon, if they wanted to work out all the final things. They could take their knapsack back with them. They'd get a pass, for rail line pass, to head back home. Sometimes it would happen quickly, and like I say, sometimes it would take many weeks. And there was a lot of grumbling as the men, often were very close to home. They might have been from Philadelphia. Most of the regiments represented at the camp were Philadelphia-based regiments. So these men were only miles from home, but yet they had to sit up there.
What was their daily life like?
It was a lot of downtime. They might be given make-work assignments around the camp to clear out the camp or to gather firewood, but a lot of it would be probably playing cards and catching up, telling stories, resting up from the trauma of war. Many of them, hundreds of them, were being treated by the camp hospital. And so they would have to report there, and some of them would be what we'd call outpatients. They would go and get their treatment and then go back to their barracks and rest up. Others were so sick they would have to check in, and a few of them died up there, but others went home and still were not in good health. So it was a mix of what they were doing, but they would. There was some laxity in giving them passes to go off the site, to go, up to Norristown, up to Conshohocken, into Philly. But they had to report back and be there for the morning roll call. Otherwise, they would be thrown into the guardhouse. And there were men going AWOL. They weren't, altogether never coming back. They would go home for a while, or they just overstay their pass and then be disciplined for that. So there were discipline problems, but by and large, the men, like I say, had a lot of downtime, and some were probably happy to have downtime and just rest up from the rigors of war. Others were so restless and wanted to get out, and there were complaints. In the book, we describe some of these complaints about the time they had to kill there.
Well, talk about some of those complaints. What were people concerned about?
Well, they wanted to get home. They had done everything that they were expected to do. They would hand it in their paperwork, and they just had to sit. And they also were feeling like the officers were kind of a ragtag bunch themselves there, felt like the camp wasn't well run. One fellow, we have a long letter that he wrote to his congressman complaining about how long he and others had been there. And he got action. Within a few days, he was discharged. But it was a constant complaint. There's a term of the day, a growler's paradise, and the camp seemed to have been a growler's paradise. No one really wanted to be there. Think of it, they'd gone through 3 years of horrific war. These were young men, and they were ready to get home, and their families wanted them to get home as well. And often they were very close to home, so they just, it was like a way station they had to sit at. It's an interesting aspect of the war that really is not that well understood and written about, researched. There's the final months of the war and first few months of the peace in 65, 66, and the challenges of demobilizing this vast army and doing it in a orderly, methodical way while there was so much agitation to get out. and also how to handle the stragglers. A lot of the regiments were discharged in an orderly way. They held together through the months of the war, and they were mustered out in the field and then sent back to the state to what were called rendezvous points, where they would again get their final pay and their discharge papers, and off they'd go. This camp was there to handle the forgotten ones, the ones who were the stragglers who had been down south, who some were half dead by the time they arrived from back. Hundreds of them had been at Andersonville, that notorious Confederate prison camp in southern Georgia. We have a list of that in the book. There were 331 from Andersonville.
Now, if you and I were soldiers riding the train up from Philadelphia and we stepped off the train, what would we see as we arrived?
Well, we'd see the hustle bustle of the city, and I'm sure be pretty amazed and happy to be there. But then still under military command, so they had to report to this adjutant's office down at 11th and Spruce in what's now Center City, Philly, and stick to it, go there and report and be sent away. So there they were in the city, but then quickly on a train and hustled away to this remote camp on a wooded hillside.
What was the camp like? How big was it? What type of structure?
Yeah, it was about a quarter-mile square. It was surrounded by a big, like a Fort Apache fence, a 12-foot high stockade fence all the way around, quarter mile, more or less. Again, it ran up the slope and then flattened out toward the top. There were 10 barracks buildings, two-story, pretty big, impressive barracks buildings that were just built for this. Toward the upper end, and then at the very top there were administrative headquarters and the officers' quarters, and other supply buildings. And that was like a campus, a quadrant. In the middle was a parade ground. A lot of the time, the commandant was working hard to level out that parade ground on what was very uneven terrain. In hopes of having, parade drills and marching and all. It didn't seem like he was very successful at that, and the book gets into that as well. He had envisioned having the public show up for Sunday dress parade, and people weren't really showing up, and they canceled that. But he was working hard to get that graded. And then there were latrines scattered around as well. The bottom half was a trail leading up from the train stop and the old farmhouse, the old settlers' farmhouse, where the commandant not only lived but brought his family to join him. Yeah.
Now, the camp was designed by John MacArthur, an architect. Who was he?
How about that? He was a renowned architect who worked for the quartermaster of the Army, designing and overseeing the construction of a number of military installations, including big hospitals, but depots and other bases like this. And he went on after the war to gain renown as the architect of Philadelphia City Hall. Our massive City Hall. That's the product of John MacArthur.
Who was the camp commander?
Believe it or not, his name was John Hancock. I tried to find his signature somewhere, was unable to see how he signed his name. He was the kid brother of Winfield Scott Hancock, who was a very famous Civil War general, one of the heroes of Gettysburg. And so John had already served as a junior officer in one of the regiments and gotten a Medal of Honor. So he was served with distinction himself. But he angled to get this assignment back closer to home. He was from Norristown, and so he got it. No surprise. And he went as a young man in his early 30s. He was the commandant of this camp. There was also staffed by hundreds of garrison guards, they would be called, who would police the camp. So the number of men who went there to be discharged was, by our reckoning, a little over 1,100. Again, be aware they were just fragments of many other regiments, 89 regiments in all. So there were about 1,100 of them, and then over time, in a rolling way, there were waves of garrison guards brought in that numbered over 600. So he had 600 men under his command, and he was just basically trying to keep a lid on things, keep the men there. So when the discharge was ready, they would be there and they would be processed out.
What kind of a commander was Hancock? Did he get along with the men?
He was overseeing their well-being. Yeah, I mean, you get a mixed picture of him. He was able to be sure their barracks were insulated carefully. They were well cared for. He had to crack down on discipline because of this AWOL problem, and he was throwing men into the brig, into the guardhouse. He comes across as a little bit of a prideful. He was very concerned about his parade ground, and he arranged to bring in a band and to have a band tent set up for the band. He had dreams of having a very fancy place, and he fancied up his farmhouse and brought up his wife and kids as well as daughters. And one of the reports on the camp that is in the book also has another representative of the quartermaster coming up and saying, who the heck wanted to build a camp here, and what was this guy fancying up his farmhouse like this for? And he couldn't believe the camp was up there. So you get a kind of a mixed picture of the man as brave in his time in battle, and yet a little bit vain, you might say, in how he administered the camp.
So you mentioned that the camp was inspected, and they commented on Hancock's use of the camp. In the book, you say that in the inspection report, it says 2/3 of this ground is for the use of the command, and the remaining 1/3 seems to be reserved for the convenience of the commander. They didn't seem to have a high opinion of him.
Yes. How about that? By then, this was at the tail end of the camp's time, so this was kind of a kick in the pants on as the door was closing anyway. So there was no discipline for him in particular. It was just the officer sent up there was just astonished that things had been run like that. But Hancock was near the end of his term of service as well. So yes, it was a slap in the face, you might say, but there was no consequence particular that I could tell for him. He went on after the war to become a lawyer and spent most of the rest of his career in Washington, D.C., where he died and is buried.
One of the features of the camp was a very large flagpole. How did Hancock get that flagpole?
Yeah, how about that? It apparently towered over the area could be seen for miles around. Well, there had been a sanitary commission fair held just before the camp was being, ordered and constructed. It was at what's now Logan Circle in downtown Philadelphia, where the Franklin Institute is and some other institutions people will be familiar with. And you can see in old pictures of the sanitary fair this enormous flagpole. And it's the one that then he arranged to get and have moved up and erected up on the hilltop at Camp Discharge, way up at the upper end of the grounds, and enormous. And then after when they auctioned off and sold off all the articles of the camp, that flagpole went up to a mill, actually, that was up in Balagomingo Mill up in Conshohocken, where it was erected, and we have a picture of that in the book as well, until finally a fire brought it down in the 1870s, I believe it was.
Now, in the book, you mentioned that the medical records show that infectious diseases at the camp included things like smallpox, typhoid, cowpox, diphtheria, influenza. What was that experience like for them?
Can you imagine? Yeah. And so, like I say, some of these men showed up very ill with contagious diseases. And you can imagine some of the other men would not want to set foot in the infirmary, in the hospital there, because of fear of, picking it up themselves. So hospitals were not places where you went to get healed. Often it's where you would go to die, your last stage. Yeah, it was bad. And they were treated with some powerful and inappropriate medicines of the day. Medicine was pretty primitive in the U.S. back then. The germ theory of disease was starting to take hold in Europe, but not really in the U.S. as well. And so there were still these old-fashioned beliefs in how you treated diseases. That disease was spread through bad air, through miasma. They were called miasmatic diseases. And some of the ways to try to treat it would be to get rid of noxious ingredients in people by basically dehydrating them or bleeding them. There were treatments where they would try to get all of your saliva out, or try to get all of the urine out of your system, or sweat, to have you sweat deliberately, or like I say, bleeding, or they would do this cupping where they'd put a cup on your skin to suck up a big blood blister, you might call it, on the surface, in order to try to purge these noxious ingredients. Well, it wasn't effective. It was not working. Also, some of the medicines they were cooking up had some very toxic ingredients themselves. Mercury was in widespread use, and different variations of mercury, which is a poison. And some of the other treatments they were giving were ineffectively, nothing much in them. It'd be like oatmeal, and different things like that weren't really doing the trick either. So it was a rough, long haul for some of these men, and they never really recovered. There were stories of men getting back home after the war and dying within weeks or months of the war, dying, just dropping dead on the street. Others had lingering diseases that debilitated them for the rest of their lives, and we tell some of those stories in there. So, people need to understand this. It was a time of glory, but also a time of real misery for these men who had gone off to war in the prime of life. I mean, you've got to remember, when they signed up in 61, these 3-year men I was referring to earlier, they probably thought the war was going to be over in summer, that they'd be back by harvest or certainly by winter. Well, no, we know that did not happen. The war became just a slugfest that went on for years, and they did have to serve their full term if they lived through it. And like I say, a number of the ones who went up to Camp Discharge had been captured and held in these miserable prison camps where they had picked up other diseases, a lot of skin diseases you're finding as well in the hospital record. We were able at the National Archives to come up with the register of all the soldiers who were treated by the doctors there, and also the book of the treatments that they were getting, which was great. That was like a gold mine to find that, and we have a lot of that in the book as well. The good old National Archives in Washington has many, many things I could tell stories about our research adventures down there.
Now, you were talking about just the experiences with the disease, and you mentioned in the book that diarrhea killed more than 57,000 men in the Union Army.
Yes, amazing. And you see a lot of diarrhea in the medical report from the hospital up there for sure. And dysentery, which is where it gets bloody and is really, really deadly. So they would give men astringents, to stop the diarrhea, but then that would cause other problems too. That would be treated improperly. So, it was not a happy time for a lot of these men. And if they were lucky enough not to be admitted to the hospital, they'd still probably be back in their bunk, much of the time just trying to recover and pray they got back home.
What kind of a diet would these soldiers have had?
Well, we don't know from the records there exactly, but it might have been a diet that would constipate them. One of the doctors that I talked to, a current day doctor who's a specialist in Civil War medicine, felt like they would have a diet that would be not have roughage in it. It would be full of starch, and it would be full of beans and potatoes and things that would not not be appropriate, and might have caused some of their intestinal ailments themselves. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned that part of Colonel Hancock's duties was just to keep people around to wait for their paperwork to come through. Did people just wander away?
No, there was the stockade fence, so they'd have to have a pass. But the idea, during the period when it was cracking down, is that everybody had to stay there during the daytime in the event that the train would show up from downtown Philly. That there was a stop right at the bottom of the camp, where the train ran along the Schuylkill. It's more or less on the roadbed of the Schuylkill Expressway now. It was the Reading line. So an adjutant representative would come up with either the package to give to the the soldier as he was being discharged, or simply a question for that soldier. Maybe something needed to be worked out, and so we would need to interview a soldier. So the men needed to be there, so they could be summoned in the event either they were getting out, hallelujah, or they needed to be questioned by somebody. So during the day they would mill around and sit around, and then at night they could get passes, but they needed to be back again by morning roll call.
So some of these men had families locally. Did families
Yes.
visit them, or did they have a chance to go visit their families?
Well, yeah, during their pass, when they had a pass, and if their family was close enough, they would certainly go see them. Sometimes when we were away overstaying their pass, they would presumably be off seeing their families as well. We don't have a lot of record of families showing up there. There's a reference in one of the regimental histories that I read that the locals were very kind to the soldiers, which was good to hear, but also puzzling. We were not able to find any references to delegations of local citizens or even individual local citizens coming, to bring food or to organize prayer groups or the kind of things that might have happened back then, were happening elsewhere back then. So I'm not exactly sure. I think that probably it's more likely people wanted to stay away out of fear of picking up, a contagious disease there. We know the local workers came to help build the place, and there may have been a presence of them coming in as perhaps blacksmiths or other necessary day laborers there. But in terms of a caring presence, it did not show up in the records. It was one of those things we looked hard for and could not find.
In the book, when you're talking about some of these soldiers, you talk about some of them had, quote, seen the elephant, unquote. What did that mean?
Yeah, interesting term. It was military jargon, military slang for seeing combat, being thrust into the horrifying, terrifying combat. Was this term. They had seen the elephant, and these men had seen the elephant. Nearly all of them had been in multiple battles, and these were the big historic battles of the Civil War. These Pennsylvania men, most of them were in part of the Army of the Potomac. They had signed up as Pennsylvania volunteers and been federalized, so put under federal command. They had been at Bull Run, they had been at Antietam, they had been at Gettysburg, Fredericksburg, Petersburg, the March to the Sea down in Atlanta. Some of them had been part of that. Nashville, all of them. So they had seen the elephant and then some, and seen often, their friends wounded, dead, sick, around them. So they had perhaps been wounded themselves, or they had killed men. So they were shaken up psychologically, as you can imagine. Seeing the elephant is something that I'm sure they saw in their nightmares for the rest of their lives.
Now, these soldiers were people who had been separated from the units for one reason or another. Did it also include people like deserters?
Yes, there were some deserters there, and I looked for court-martial records and was not able to find specifics on them, so we don't know. Some of them would get clemency and would have to go serve their time back with the rest of their regiment, or be assigned to another regiment in order to qualify for their discharge pay and their papers, which are, good things to have back then. Others may have been imprisoned. We just don't know. President Lincoln at one point issued a sweeping clemency order saying if the men reported back to their regiments by a certain date, they would be, granted clemency. And we know a case or two at the camp where that was why somebody showed up again, and citing that presidential, clemency. So I don't know exactly what was done for them. There were a lot of court-martials. They would have been held right at the camp, I'm sure. And there's no record that we could find of exactly the outcome of each case. But yes, there were deserters there.
Now, you mentioned one group of people called the Invalid Corps. What was that?
Yeah, those were men who had been wounded or had been sick and were not able to be put back into action, but they still had time, or they wanted to, remain in uniform, and so they had this corps called the Invalid Corps that did light duty. They might have been a guard somewhere, and like at a camp like Camp Discharge, but other places as well. And so the Invalid Corps was a presence up there as well.
Now, one of the soldiers who was at the camp was Captain Damon Kilgore, and he had a bit of a relationship with the commander Hancock. But what was going on there?
Yeah, he was a feisty guy. And when you think that Hancock went on to be a lawyer later, the two of them were argumentative and not afraid to butt heads, and they butted heads big time. It was one of those things where Kilgore didn't really have the right to claim to try to ignore an order, or have one of his men ignore an order from the commandant, from Colonel Hancock, but he did. He said, anybody needs to report to me, and I will okay an order or not, for something that affects my work up here and quartermaster's work. And actually, he had no right to do that. Hancock outranked him, and so they butted heads over that for a while. It had to do with cleaning out the site. It was a trivial matter, but it became this fight that only escalated, and there were threats back and forth and orders back and forth, and finally they had to break them up and reassign Kilgore elsewhere. So it's a crazy kind of sidelight up there that probably was the talk of the camp when it was happening, to have this showdown between these two, ranking officers up there. And Hancock, prevailed, as should have happened, but there were fireworks. Meanwhile, while this is happening, tons and tons of soldiers are showing up there. By that point, many of them were POWs, from Andersonville and elsewhere, who had finally made their way back north. And the camp is doing its business of processing them and doing all this while this distracting sideshow is happening. It's an interesting part of the book.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about Andersonville. Where was it, and what was it known for?
Yeah, it was down in southern Georgia, and it was known for the crowded conditions and the horrible treatment of the men down there. More than 14,000 Union soldiers died while in captivity at Andersonville, and they were just dropping dead like flies. The worst of it, hundreds a day were dying in the muck down there. The outhouse was their open, kind of a swampy pit. There was also their drinking water. So you can imagine the intestinal diseases running rampant, and men losing much weight, getting emaciated, malnourished. There were chiggers and other kind of critters that were getting under their skin and causing skin diseases, skin rashes. It was just a miserable place. We were able to read some of the memoirs of survivors of Andersonville and men who went to Camp Discharge to really get a vivid and graphic accounts of some of what they went through. It was horrible. And I summarized some of that in the book, the things that were happening. A lot of scurvy, from vitamin deficiency, where men's teeth were falling out, and men so miserable and so deranged in some cases, they would just walk up to the wall to be shot. They would cross what was called the dead line. And that really was what it meant by a deadline. You cross this, you're dead. And they just willingly walked across there to, be shot dead, to put themselves out of their misery.
Now, you have a photo in the book of a man who's basically just skin and bones.
Yes.
Were you shocked by the condition of some of these men?
I had known this because Andersonville is notorious. And my father, I remember, had a book called Andersonville that I had read as well. So I knew how horrific it was. But, yeah, these pictures are hard to take. One is in there just to give people an idea how extreme and horrible the place was. And that was a man actually from White Marsh, I think, outside Philadelphia. He didn't go to Camp Discharge. He might have, but he died before he got there. He died in Maryland. There was another camp that was a first stop for a lot of the, where they really got medical treatment was at this camp in Annapolis, Maryland. And he died there.
Is there any record about how people in that condition were treated medically when they arrived at these camps?
Yeah, well, a lot of their first treatment to kind of stabilize them would be down at this Camp Parole. And then by the time they got up there, oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, they would be given, depending on what they had, treatment for skin diseases and treatment for, malnutrition. Try to gently get some food into them. Most of them were able to get at least out of the camp and back home. There's a handful of them who died. We were not able to locate where they were buried, but their names were there, who died. But most of them made it out, but then some of them died soon back home. We have some accounts in the book of that. Yeah.
Now, you write about in 1905, many of these POWs returned to Andersonville, and that there was a memorial down there for the Pennsylvanians who died. You say that there are 1,849 Pennsylvanians who died there.
Yes, and the states around that time, that was a period when a lot of the battlefields were getting memorials or monuments to the regiments and to, different actions where this is a spot where the, 49th Pennsylvania held the line and the 72nd and, et cetera. And also at Andersonville, states were setting up monuments to their soldiers who had passed away down there. And Pennsylvania was dedicating its memorial then. And so the state had commissioned this memorial and paid the train fare for survivors of Andersonville who were still living who wanted to go down for this ceremony. And a number of men I was able to piece together who from Camp Discharge was among those men who went down, and they had a ceremony there. It was very moving for a lot of these men, as you can imagine, who were barefoot and bedraggled and, were able to go later in life by then and, in their suits and go and just, it all came back to them. And some of them were really angry because that was a point where the South was promulgating this idea of the lost cause, and it had been a noble cause, and the country was turning away, and there was a lot of Jim Crow law down there, and men, black men being lynched, and so these Northerners were going down there, kind of grumbling about, all that, and wanting to remind the country about the Union cause and what the war was about.
Right, and you say in the book, you talk about General Harry White from Indiana, Pennsylvania, and you talk about his speech where he says, following what you were saying, his speech decried the new crop of Southern history textbooks that depicted Northerners as aggressors and Southerners as noble victims. Don't be fooled, he said. The rebel doctrines of nullification and secession had been unconstitutional and traitorous.
And he said this in southern Georgia. I should have, now that I say it, I should have looked at whether the Georgia newspapers picked that up or had some tart response to it. But yeah, he declared that, in front of everybody at this ceremony.
So as the war was coming to an end, were more and more soldiers coming to Camp Discharge?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So the war ends in April, or officially ends when Lee, there were a few skirmishes after that, but April. And the prisoner exchanges had already resumed, so a lot of soldiers had been released from the POW camps and were making their way north. But yes, also others were making their way. And so the peak of the camp was in May of 65, and then June, and through the summer was quite busy as well. It was an interesting dilemma for the military too, because they had orders to demobilize and to cut costs and to mothball installations that were not needed. And they were doing that, but they had to do it in an orderly way, as orderly as they could. While the public was agitating to get the men home, the men were agitating to get home. and the government was wanting, cost cutting. They couldn't just close things up immediately, and at least in a place like Camp Discharge, because there were still these men who were needing to have their paperwork be reconciled. Also, I should mention, the Army was even summarily closing hospitals and sending men out of the hospitals even during that spring and summer. So there was a real, on the one hand, a real rush order, and on the other, they wanted to, not just send people off who were way sick or they hadn't worked out their paperwork. In this crunch, they were able to do that. They were able to reconcile paperwork and get the men out. But it must have been, it was like 24/7 kind of work. And then finally, by late summer, the work was done. The only men left in the hospital really were camp guards, and one or two of the other men who simply were not ready to go home yet, were not able to go home yet. But most of them were camp guards, which is interesting. A lot of the camp guards had VD, which they had gotten from their nightly doings in the city, or brought VD up with them. But that's another story. I didn't mention VD was pretty rampant. But so they were treated, and finally the hospital was closed, and the camp was, I'll say, mothballed by autumn, and then they inventoried everything and put it up for auction. A lot of other places were being auctioned. There were auctions as well, auctions of horses and mules and supplies and other things. And then in this case of Camp Discharge, auction of all the boards and all the nails and all the cooking pots and all these other implements, shingles. So they had an auction in early 1866, and things were, people came up and they had a couple of weeks to haul everything away, and things were hauled away, repurposed.
So some of these things were repurposed, even buildings. Or what happened to some of the buildings?
Some of the buildings, some of the proprietors of mills, again, up in Conshohocken, we know of two mill operators who bought a lot of the lumber for the buildings and used them for housing for their workers, or probably for buildings on the mills as well. This Balagomingo mill that I mentioned earlier, that had the flagpole, they also bought some of the barracks buildings. And there was one of the doctors who also bought the barn and had the barn moved over. And then there's the sentry box. He bought, this is a Dr. Corson, he bought the sentry box and then gave it as a gift to one of the local friends of his. But the sentry box still exists. You can see the sentry box. It's the only building, the only real large thing from the camp that still exists, and it's on a intersection of Spring Mill Road, which is up along the river, and a little lane called Sentry Lane. And it's lovingly tended by a local resident, and he lights it up and has a flag outside it, and make sure it's painted. So that's what's left of Camp Discharge.
Where did the flagpole go afterwards?
It went up to Balagomingo Mill, was erected there, and like I say, burned down in, I believe it was the 1870s when it caught fire. There was a fire at the mill.
So how well known is this site? When did you first find out about it?
Yeah, not well known at all. It's basically a forgotten story. Even folks who knew about it sometimes had misimpressions of it. And when I'm, just talking about the book, people are like, really? That was up there? And no idea. And so this man who got the sentry box later on was given by this doctor to him. He was Howard Wood. And Philadelphia, or Conshohocken, had a steel company, an iron company that turned into a steel company called Allen Wood Steel. And so Howard Wood was the operator of that company back then, wealthy man. He built his summer estate on a bluff right near Camp Discharge, within sight of the old Camp Discharge site. He called his estate Camp Discharge, as I say, to keep the name alive. And some of the maps later put Camp Discharge up there, confusing that estate site, which was not anywhere near as big, with the Camp Discharge, which was, again, maybe a couple hundred yards south of it. That's one confusion, but also there was a sense that Camp Discharge was just a field full of pup tents, just an open field with tents. No, it actually had these fixed barracks, large, imposing barracks. My co-author had the thrill of going to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania early in his research for this and through some digging, coming upon the only photo of Camp Discharge that is known to exist. And there you see these barracks buildings. And then later in our research, we were able to find the drawings, MacArthur's drawings, that had diagrams of the barracks buildings. So, that was rare to have big barrack buildings like that.
Talk a little bit more about your research. Are the military records at the camp still in existence?
They are, yeah. Some of them are online there's a great military website called Fold 3, Fold numeral 3, that refers to how you fold a flag at a funeral. But Fold 3 has some of it, and we were able to scour and find those, but a lot of it is down at the National Archives. Some was actually at the archives up in, the National Archives had a branch up in Northeast Philly. They had some. The core of it, though, is going to be down in Washington, D.C., where we were able to go they have an annex in Maryland, which is where we found those drawings of the camp and of the camp buildings, which was a real breakthrough. And they also then have all the pension paperwork for the men themselves and some of the reports by the officers following battles and engagements. But the pension paperwork is the gold mine, where you find what the individual men went through in the war. They or their widows would apply for them and give testimony and affidavits, or doctors' affidavits, or the lawyers would do some research talking to neighbors and testifying to what actually the men had gone through during the war, and then what they'd gone through after the war that caused them to be applying for a disability pension, or then the widow to get a widow's pension. And yeah, that's where you find that. We spent hours going through those, and it really, the stories just grab you. These were men in the prime of life, and a lot of them came out as old men, 3-4 years later, never really recovered.
Did you find any letters or diaries by either soldiers who were part of the garrison or those who were just passing through?
Yes, we did. Yeah. And some of the other research was finding the regimental histories, and that's where you would find blow-by-blow accounts of what their regiment did, and often what the individual soldiers had done during the battle, and that's where we were able to piece together certain things. And yes, and some of the men wrote memoirs, and we were able to get access to a few memoirs, which were great. And there were a lot of diaries that we referred to in there as well, where the men had, through their lives, recounted what they did, what their comrades did. So it was a fascinating process of pulling all that together through various sources.
What kind of archaeological explorations have gone on at the site?
Yeah. So Brad Upp, my co-author and research partner, he grew up in that area already in Gladwin, PA. His home was a few miles away. As a kid, he knew about this camp. He actually remembered playing on that hillside as a kid, doing a little bit of exploring. Over the years, he has become a Civil War reenactor and an excavator. He has a metal detector. He also has a lot of skills in knowing what he's seeing, what he's getting, how to clean it off and treat it properly. He was realizing he had to find the trash pits, and the trash pits, or refuse pits really, were where you were likely to find concentrations of things. Trash pits also would often be the latrine as well. Fortunately, 150 years later, you could dig into that, and it's not going to gross you out or get you sick, but that's where the items that would be tossed in. He would dig down like 6 feet, like a grave digger, go down 6 feet, and you would start finding. He was finding a lot of things. So he has a display of things. It's remarkable, and he knows what they are. I have some of them. We show them at talks. But plenty of bullets, plenty of buttons, but other things like old bone pipes, wedding bands, accoutrement from weapons, from rifles, from scabbards, other adornment on the uniforms or insignia markers. Great stuff. And there it is. And he's dug over the months. The current owner of the property, which is the Philadelphia Country Club, a private country club, has given him permission to go during certain periods of the year to do his digging, and he's up there spending countless hours. He loves it, but you got to be a big bear of a man like him to be able to do that hand digging. And he's dug up plenty of things, and he's still wanting to do more of it.
Now, you've written previously about the Civil War, and you've been on PA Books before for
Yes.
some of those books. What draws you to the Civil War?
Well, my dad was a Civil War buff. I used to play Civil War when I was a kid, read about it a lot. I came of age during the centennial of the Civil War, like a lot of us, and it was in the air. And again, through my dad as well. I had an ancestor who was in the Civil War. I grew up having his old veteran's cap, his GAR, kepi cap, the recognizable cap that soldiers wore back then. And heard stories about it. Brad, the same. Brad has an ancestor who was captured. He has read over his diary, so it's meaningful to him personally. It's a very dramatic time in our history, and it's constantly being revisited. So it's a lot of people care deeply about the Civil War. Believe me.
Now, you said that the site is owned, at least in part, by this country club.
Correct.
If people wanted to visit, is it open to the public, or do they have to make arrangements?
Well, at present, there's a trail, a public access trail is the only way to get to the site. And at present, you'd go through there. There's no signage. One of our goals, and I think this is going to happen, is to have signs in place, markers with text explaining what's where, what you're seeing, what happened here. That will be once you're on the premises of the camp itself. But if you wanted to go, you could go. There's a nature center up in that area called River Bend. They have a parking lot, and right off the parking lot is the entrance, a marked entrance to this trail. And you go down about a half mile down the trail, down toward the city. It parallels you're above on this hillside. You're paralleling the river and the Schuylkill Expressway. You head down this trail and you get to foundations. And those are the foundations of a barn that was a settler barn. The spring house that was original spring house that supplied some of the water to the camp, and the foundation of the farmhouse where the commandant set up shop. Set up his residence. That's there, and we're hoping to get markers there, and then at either end of the trail have something about the camp as well. But you can go there now. I would urge people to hold off a little bit, and maybe by next spring or so, we'll have some signage that will really, enhance their appreciation of what they're seeing. Yes, that's the goal, and that's what you would see.
Now, we talked about people like Hancock and Kilgore. Were there any other figures that you discovered in your research that you thought were really interesting?
Yeah, and we profile about 15 or 16 of them and their fate after the war. I'll mention a few of them briefly. There was a man who was a German-Jewish immigrant. His name was Albert Thalheimer. And he went in a regiment of probably German speakers, largely German speakers. And he went to Andersonville, lost 100 pounds, half his body weight, survived, came back, ended up in Reading, PA, where he became an entrepreneur, had several businesses. Finally, the one that was most successful was a cigar box manufacturing company. But always he cared deeply about other veterans, where he hired a number of them. even, ones that were kind of somewhat infirm to do what they could in his factory. He advocated for the rights of and pensions for the soldiers. He set aside land for an old soldiers' home and for a monument at Mount Penn, which is right there in Reading as well. And always kept them close and lobbied on their behalf. So he's a success story, you might say. We have plenty of others of kind of grim stories of men who never really did well and died young from one disease or another. But I'll mention a little more about a man named Isaac Horner. Brad Upp happened to be the one who opened up his pension file, and there falls out his diary from the war in Andersonville and a couple of photos of him. And these photos were rare to have at all, let alone they were the photos in the pension file. And they were because he had abandoned his family after the war and taken off and resettled with another family in Ohio and became like a farmhand and a hand there and almost a member of that family. When he died, somebody in that family reached out to the family back in Camden, had learned only at that point, I guess from papers that this Isaac had that he came upon and realized, oh my gosh. And so he notified them, and these two families corresponded and traded photos and wanted to visit each other, somehow reconciled, realizing, they were victims of this man's abandonment and the war, you might say, in a larger sense. And his story is told in there as well.
Well, we've been speaking with Jim Remsen. He is the author of Back from Battle, The Forgotten Story of Pennsylvania's Camp Discharge and the Weary Civil War Soldiers It Served. Jim, thank you for speaking with us.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details.